My name is Naomi Carter, and I never imagined that the happiest day of my life would also mark the beginning of the darkest chapter I'd ever survive. I was 32, living in a small apartment in Portland, Oregon, working double shifts as a hospital nurse to support my ailing father. My mother had passed when I was 19, and since then, it had just been the two of us, me and Dad, scraping by, grateful for whatever small joys life offered. I never dreamed of marrying into wealth. I didn't even want it. All I wanted was someone who would love me for who I was. That someone turned out to be Daniel Whitfield. He walked into the hospital one evening, pale and anxious, carrying his elderly grandmother in his arms, after she'd collapsed at a restaurant nearby. I was the nurse on duty. I calmed him down, stabilized her, and stayed 2 extra hours past my shift just to make sure she was comfortable. "You didn't have to do that," he told me later, in the hallway, his eyes red from worry finally easing. "She needed someone," I said simply. "That's enough of a reason." He looked at me like no one ever had. What I didn't know that night was that Daniel wasn't just some ordinary man. He was the son of Eleanor Whitfield, the woman who owned half the luxury real estate in the city, a name whispered with both admiration and fear in every elite circle of Portland. Daniel courted me for 8 months. Quiet dinners, long walks, late-night phone calls when my father's health worsened, and I needed someone to simply listen. He never once made me feel like the poor nurse from the East Side. He made me feel like Naomi, just Naomi, and that was enough for him. When he proposed, I cried for an hour before I could even say yes. But the first time I met his mother, Eleanor Whitfield, something cold settled in my chest. She looked me up and down in her marble-floored living room, her eyes lingering on my thrift store dress, and said, with a smile sharp enough to cut glass, "So you're the girl my son wants to throw his future away on." Daniel squeezed my hand. "Mom, please. I'm only being honest," Eleanor said, turning back to me. "Tell me, dear, do you even know what silverware to use at a formal dinner?" I smiled politely and said nothing. I had no idea that smile would cost me more than I could ever imagine, and that Eleanor Whitfield had already begun planning exactly how she was going to destroy me. The wedding was small by Whitfield standards, but to me it felt like a dream. Daniel insisted on marrying quickly. He said he didn't want to give his mother time to interfere. I should have listened to the warning buried inside that sentence. Eleanor didn't attend the courthouse ceremony. She sent a single white envelope instead, delivered by her driver. Inside was a check for exactly $1, and a note in her elegant handwriting. "This is what your love is worth to this family. Spend it wisely." Daniel wanted to confront her. I stopped him. "Let her be angry," I said. "We don't need her blessing to be happy." I truly believed that. I was wrong. 3 months into our marriage, my father passed away quietly in his sleep. Daniel held me through nights I couldn't stop crying, and for a while, grief and love tangled together until I could barely tell them apart. Eleanor sent no condolences. Not a single word. It was Daniel who insisted we move into the guest wing of the Whitfield estate just for a while. He said, "Until you're back on your feet." I resisted. Something in my gut warned me. But Daniel looked so hopeful, so certain that time would soften his mother's heart, that I agreed. I was wrong about that too. From the very first morning, Eleanor made her rules clear. I wasn't to speak during her dinner parties unless spoken to. I wasn't to sit in her chair by the fireplace. I wasn't to touch the family photographs displayed in the hallway. "Those are for people who belong in them," she said, not even looking up from her tea. The staff watched me with pity I didn't want. I began eating in the kitchen instead of the dining room, just to avoid Eleanor's stares over the imported china. One evening, I overheard her on the phone with her sister. "She's beneath us, Margaret. A nurse. Can you imagine? I give her 6 months before Daniel comes to his senses." I stood frozen in the hallway, my hand pressed against the cold wall, willing myself not to cry. That night, Daniel found me sitting alone in the dark guest room. "What's wrong?" he asked, sitting beside me. I almost told him everything, but something stopped me, a strange, quiet instinct that whispered, "Not yet." Instead, I smiled and said, "Just tired." He kissed my forehead and left for an early meeting the next morning. I didn't know then that it would be the last. peaceful night I'd have in that house. Because the very next day, Eleanor Whitfield decided it was time to humiliate me in front of everyone who mattered to her. The next evening, Eleanor hosted one of her grand dinner parties, the kind where senators, business partners, and old money families gathered beneath crystal chandeliers to trade compliments and secrets in the same breath. Daniel had a late meeting out of state and wouldn't be back until midnight. I almost stayed in the guest wing, but Eleanor herself knocked on my door that afternoon, smiling in a way that should have warned me. "Join us tonight, Naomi," she said sweetly. "It's time you met everyone properly." I should have known that smile meant something was coming. I wore the only formal dress I owned, a simple navy gown I'd bought for my father's retirement dinner years ago. When I walked into the ballroom, conversations dimmed for a moment, eyes sweeping over me, then quickly returning to their champagne glasses. Eleanor waited until the room was fullest, until the string quartet paused between songs, before she raised her glass and turned to me, with a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Everyone, I'd like to introduce my son's wife, Naomi." A pause, timed like a performance. "She used to be a nurse. Now she just empties bedpans in my house instead of a hospital." Laughter rippled through the crowd, polite, cruel, practiced. My face burned. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Eleanor wasn't finished. "In fact," she continued, stepping closer, "I think it's only fair everyone knows the truth. Naomi's father left her nothing but debt. She married my son for exactly what you'd expect." "That's not true," I said, my voice shaking. "Oh." Eleanor's smile sharpened. "Then prove it. Tell everyone here what you brought into this marriage besides your hospital scrubs." The room waited. I felt every eye, every whisper pressing against my skin like heat. And then, just as I opened my mouth to respond, a man near the back of the room, someone I'd never seen before, tall, silver-haired, with the quiet authority of someone used to being obeyed, stepped forward. "Actually, Eleanor," he said calmly, "I believe I can answer that question better than she can." The room went silent. Eleanor's smile faltered for the first time all night. "Richard," she said, her voice suddenly tight, "this isn't your concern." "It became my concern," he replied, "the moment I recognized this young woman's name from a file on my desk this morning. I had no idea who this man was, or what file he was talking about. But whatever it was, it made Eleanor Whitfield a woman who never flinched take a visible step back." The room stayed frozen, every guest holding their breath, waiting to see what would unfold between Eleanor and this stranger she clearly feared. "Richard, please," Eleanor said, her composure cracking at the edges. "Whatever business matter you're referring to, this isn't the place." "On the contrary," Richard said, turning to address the room, "I think it's exactly the place. Since you've made Mrs. Whitfield's character a public matter tonight." He turned to me, his expression softening. "Forgive me, I should introduce myself. Richard Hale, senior partner at Hale and Bennett Law. I handle estate matters for several families in this room, including, until recently, the final affairs of a man named Thomas Carter." My breath caught. "Thomas Carter, my father." "You knew my father?" I whispered. "I was his attorney," Richard said gently, "for the last 11 years. He came to my office shortly after your mother passed, and asked me to manage something quietly, without your knowledge, because he didn't want you worrying about money while you cared for him." Eleanor's face had gone pale, but I couldn't understand why yet. "Your father wasn't a man of debt, Naomi," Richard continued. "He was a man of extraordinary discipline. Decades ago, before you were born, he co-founded a small manufacturing patent with a college friend, a patent that, quietly, over the years, became worth a great deal of money. He never touched it. He let it grow, untouched, for you." The room had gone utterly silent. "Your father's estate," Richard said, "which fully matured and transferred to your name 3 weeks ago, is currently valued at just over $41 million. Gasps rippled through the ballroom like a wave. I couldn't breathe. I stared at Richard as if he'd spoken a foreign language. My father, who wore the same coat for 10 winters, who counted coins for bus fare, had left me a fortune he never once mentioned. "That's impossible," Eleanor said sharply, though her voice had lost all its earlier venom. "There must be some mistake." "There's no mistake," Mrs. Whitfield, Richard said, his eyes finally hardening as he looked at her. In fact, I recognized your family name the moment I saw it in her file because your company, Whitfield Properties, currently owes a rather significant outstanding debt to one of the trusts. Thomas Carter quietly held shares in. Eleanor's champagne glass slipped slightly in her hand. Which means, Richard said, letting the words settle over the stunned room, that as of this morning, Naomi doesn't just outrank you socially, Eleanor. She may very well hold the deciding vote on whether your company survives its next quarter. For a moment, nobody in that ballroom moved. Eleanor Whitfield, the woman who had spent the last 20 minutes humiliating me in front of Portland's elite, stood frozen with her champagne glass trembling in her hand. That's absurd, she finally managed, forcing a laugh that fooled no one. Whitfield Properties doesn't owe money to some trust fund. I'd be happy to send over the documentation tomorrow morning, Richard said evenly. The loan restructuring from 18 months ago, when your company needed emergency capital during the Fairview development collapse. Thomas Carter's trust was one of 3 private investors who kept Whitfield Properties from filing bankruptcy that year. I remembered that time vaguely, my father mentioning some investment, something he called it, waving it off like it was nothing when I asked. I had no idea it involved the very family that would later look down on me at their own dinner table. Eleanor's jaw tightened. This conversation is over. Actually, Richard said, I think Mrs. Naomi Whitfield deserves to finish what she was saying earlier. You asked her, in front of everyone, what she brought into this marriage besides her scrubs. I believe she has an answer now. Every eye in the room turned to me. I felt something shift inside my chest, not anger exactly, but a quiet, steady clarity I hadn't felt in months of shrinking myself in that house. I brought exactly what I've always had, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. Honesty, hard work, and a father who loved me enough to build something in silence, without ever needing anyone's approval for it. I turned to Eleanor. You called me beneath your family. You said I married Daniel for what I could take, but I never once asked him for anything, Eleanor. Not a dollar, not a title, not a seat at your table. I only ever wanted your son's love, which apparently was more than you were ever willing to give freely to anyone in this house. Eleanor said nothing. For the first time since I'd met her, she had no clever response, no sharp remark waiting behind her painted smile. Just then, the ballroom doors opened, and Daniel walked in early, still in his travel coat, clearly having rushed back the moment his meeting ended. He froze, taking in the silence, my flushed face, his mother's ashen one. What happened? He asked slowly. What did I miss? Richard turned to him with a faint, knowing smile. Quite a lot, Mr. Whitfield, he said. I'd start by asking your mother why she just tried to publicly destroy the woman who may hold your family's company in the palm of her hand. Daniel's eyes moved from Richard to his mother's stricken face, and finally to me, and I watched. In that single unbearable second, something in him began to change. Daniel crossed the ballroom floor, ignoring the whispers rippling around him, and stopped directly in front of me. His eyes searched my face, as if trying to read everything that had happened in the 20 minutes he'd been gone. Naomi, he said quietly, is this true? Your father left you $41 million, I said. Yes. I didn't know either. Not until 5 minutes ago. He turned to his mother, and for the first time in the months I'd known him, I saw real anger settle into his face, not the polite, apologetic frustration he usually offered when Eleanor overstepped, but something deeper. You humiliated my wife, he said, in front of 200 people. You called her a gold digger. You mocked her father's memory. And this whole time, you owed her family money. Daniel, I didn't know. That's not the point, Mother. His voice cracked with a rawness I'd never heard from him. You didn't know she was wealthy, so you decided it was fine to destroy her instead. That's who you are. Money was never really the issue. Cruelty was. Eleanor's composure finally shattered. Everything I've done to protect this family's name. No, Daniel said. Everything you've done to protect your own pride. The guests had begun murmuring again, some already reaching for their phones, no doubt eager to spread tonight's spectacle across every social circle in the city by morning. Eleanor seemed to realize it too, the horror of losing control of her own narrative in her own home. "Richard," Daniel said, turning back to the lawyer, "I want copies of everything. The loan agreements, the trust documents, all of it." "Of course," Richard said. "I'll have them delivered to your office by tomorrow afternoon." Daniel then did something that silenced the room completely. He took my hand, right there in front of everyone who had laughed at me 20 minutes earlier, and pressed a slow, deliberate kiss to my knuckles. "I'm sorry," he said, loud enough for the room to hear. "I should have protected you from this house the moment we moved in. That ends tonight." I felt tears building, but I refused to let them fall in front of Eleanor. "Not tonight. Not ever again." Eleanor's voice trembled as she called after us. "Daniel, where are you going?" He didn't turn around. Somewhere Naomi is finally treated the way she deserves. As we walked toward the door, I caught one last glimpse of Eleanor standing alone amid her stunned guests, her carefully built world crumbling in real time, and I realized this wasn't the end of her humiliation. It was only the beginning. We didn't return to the Whitfield estate that night. Daniel booked us a suite downtown, and for the first time in months, I slept without straining to hear Eleanor's footsteps in the hallway. But the story didn't end with one humiliating dinner party. Over the following 2 weeks, everything Eleanor Whitfield had built began quietly unraveling. Richard's documents confirmed what he'd said that night. Thomas Carter's trust held a controlling stake in the emergency loan that had saved Whitfield Properties from collapse. As the sole heir, I now held the power to call in that loan, restructure it, or let it ride. Daniel insisted the decision was entirely mine. I thought about it for days, not out of cruelty, but because I wanted to be certain of what kind of woman I wanted to become in this new chapter of my life. Someone shaped by bitterness, or someone shaped by my father's quiet dignity. I chose my father. I called a meeting, not a courtroom battle. Eleanor arrived at Richard's office pale, stripped of the icy confidence she'd worn like armor for years. Word had already spread through Portland's elite circles about the dinner party. 2 of her longtime society friends had publicly distanced themselves. Her name, once whispered with admiration, was now whispered with something closer to pity. "I'm not calling in the loan," I told her, watching her shoulders sag with relief before I continued. "But I am restructuring the terms. Effective immediately. All board decisions at Whitfield Properties require trust approval. My approval for the next 5 years. You're taking control of my company," she said quietly. "No," I said. "I'm making sure you never again have the power to humiliate someone simply because you can. Consider it supervised freedom." Daniel stood beside me, saying nothing, but the pride in his eyes spoke clearly enough. Eleanor looked at me for a long moment, something unreadable crossing her face. Not quite an apology, but perhaps the beginning of one. "Your father," she finally said, "must have been a remarkable man." "He was," I said. "He taught me that real worth isn't measured by silverware or last names. It's measured by how you treat people who can't do anything for you." As I turned to leave her office, Richard caught my arm gently. "There's one more thing," he said quietly. "Something in your father's file I haven't shared yet. A letter. He asked me to give it to you the day you finally stood up for yourself." He held out a sealed envelope, yellowed slightly with age. My name written in my father's familiar handwriting across the front. My hands trembled as I took it, unsure I was ready for whatever truth waited inside. I didn't open the letter until that night. Alone on the balcony of our new home, a modest house Daniel and I chose together, far from the marble halls of the Whitfield estate. Daniel sat beside me, silent, holding my hand as I broke the seal. "My dearest Naomi, if you're reading this, it means you finally found the courage to stand up for yourself, something I always knew was inside you, even in the hardest years, when it was just the 2 of us and not much else. I never told you about the money because I didn't want you to marry for security, or live your life waiting for an inheritance. Instead of building something real with your own hands, I wanted you to know love, real love, before you ever knew wealth. I watched you grow into a woman who gives everything to strangers in hospital beds, who never once complained about the life we had. That is worth more than any fortune I could leave you. Use this money not to prove anything to anyone who doubted you, but to build the life you deserve, one built on kindness. The same kindness you always showed me. I am, and will always be, so proud of you. Love, Dad. I cried until Daniel wrapped his arms around me, and for once, they were tears that didn't ache, they healed. 6 months later, Eleanor attended our small dinner, not as the woman who once ruled every room she entered, but quieter, humbled by everything that had happened. She'd stepped back from the company, letting Daniel take over daily operations under the trust's oversight. It wasn't forgiveness overnight, but it was a start neither of us expected. I used part of my father's inheritance to open a scholarship fund for nursing students who couldn't afford tuition, the Thomas Carter Foundation, because I remembered exactly what it felt like to work exhausting shifts while dreaming of something more. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about that ballroom, Eleanor's voice ringing out, asking what I had brought into this marriage besides my scrubs. I know the answer now, clearer than I ever could have that night. I brought myself, my father's quiet strength, and a kind of worth that no amount of silverware, or old money, or cruel laughter could ever take away. Eleanor Whitfield learned, in the end, that humiliation dies the moment truth walks into the room, and truth, like my father's love, always finds its way home. The end.